The most dangerous thing a family can do is mistake devotion for permanence. My name is Margaret Collins, and for most of my life people called me the perfect wife. They said it with admiration. They said it at church gatherings, family reunions, neighborhood barbecues, and anniversary parties. Everyone seemed impressed by how much I did for my family. What nobody ever asked was whether being the perfect wife had cost me something. I married Robert Collins when I was 25 years old. He was hardworking, dependable, and determined to build a good life. We bought a small house outside Columbus, Ohio. It was not much to look at in those early years, but I loved it. I painted every room myself. I planted flowers along the front walkway. I learned how to stretch every dollar because there never seemed to be enough of them. We raised our son Daniel there. Every morning began before sunrise. I made breakfast, packed lunches, washed clothes, balanced budgets, solved problems. I became the person everyone relied on. At first, I did not mind. In fact, I was proud of it. There is a certain satisfaction that comes from being needed. When Daniel forgot his homework, he called me. When Robert had a difficult day at work, he came to me. When holidays needed planning, meals needed cooking, gifts needed buying, appointments needed scheduling, everyone looked to me. And I always answered. Somewhere along the way, being appreciated slowly became being expected. The change happened so gradually that I barely noticed it. The family dinners appeared on the table because I made them. The clean house stayed clean because I cleaned it. Birthdays happened because I remembered them. Traditions survived because I protected them. Yet nobody talked about those things anymore. They simply existed. Like sunlight. Like running water. Like something that would always be there. Years passed. Daniel grew up, got married, and started a family of his own. His wife, Jennifer, was intelligent and ambitious. She had strong opinions and a busy schedule. At first, I genuinely wanted us to be close. I offered help whenever they needed it. I babysat when their children were young. I brought meals. During stressful weeks, I attended every school event and every family gathering. I thought that was what mothers did. What grandmothers did. What wives did. One afternoon, during a family birthday party, I stood in the kitchen washing dishes while laughter filled the dining room. Through the doorway I could see everyone gathered around the table. Robert was telling stories. Daniel was laughing. Jennifer was scrolling through pictures on her phone. The grandchildren were running around the house. It should have been a happy moment. Instead, I felt something I could not quite explain. I realized nobody had noticed I was missing from the table. Not one person had asked where I was. Not one person had offered to help. It was such a small thing. So ordinary. Yet it stayed with me. That evening, after everyone left, I sat alone in the living room. The house was finally quiet. I looked around at the photographs lining the shelves. Decades of memories stared back at me. Weddings. Graduations. Vacations. Christmas mornings. I was in almost every picture, yet somehow I felt invisible. The next morning, life continued exactly as it always had. Breakfast needed making. Errands needed running. Appointments needed scheduling. Everyone continued depending on me. And I continued giving them exactly what they needed. What none of them understood was that I had spent 43 years giving everyone exactly what they wanted. And for the first time in my life, I began wondering what would happen if one day I was no longer there to give it. For most of my life, I believed love meant making yourself useful. If someone needed help, you helped. If someone was struggling, you stepped in. If something needed to be done, you did it before anyone had to ask. That philosophy guided nearly every decision I made. Looking back now, I wonder if I taught my family a lesson I never intended to teach. I taught them that I would always be there. The weeks after that birthday party passed like every other week. Monday meant grocery shopping. Tuesday meant helping with my youngest granddaughter after school. Wednesday meant driving Robert to a medical appointment because he disliked navigating busy traffic. Thursday meant preparing meals for the weekend because Jennifer and Daniel both worked long hours. Friday meant cleaning the house before family visited. Every day had a purpose. Every day revolved around someone else's needs. One Saturday morning, Jennifer called before 8 o'clock. She sounded stressed. The children had activities in different parts of town. Daniel had an unexpected work obligation. She needed help. Of course, I said yes. I always said yes. By lunchtime, I had driven nearly 30 miles across town, picked up one grandchild from a soccer practice, delivered another to a birthday party, and stopped at the grocery store to buy ingredients for a dinner everyone expected me to prepare. Nobody demanded these things directly. That was what made it complicated. Expectations had become so normal that they no longer sounded like requests. They sounded like facts. Later that evening, everyone gathered around my dining room table. The grandchildren laughed. Robert watched television highlights between conversations. Daniel discussed work. Jennifer talked about upcoming travel plans. I carried plates from the kitchen and filled glasses when they became empty. At one point, I sat down and attempted to join a conversation about a family vacation being planned for the following summer. Several destinations were discussed. Resort prices, hotel options, flight schedules. Everyone seemed excited. Then I noticed something strange. The plans were detailed and nearly finalized, yet nobody had asked whether I wanted to go. Nobody had even mentioned my name. I sat there listening as though I were a guest in my own home. Eventually, I smiled and asked where everyone was thinking of staying. The conversation paused briefly. Jennifer looked surprised, almost as if she had forgotten I was sitting there. She quickly said they had not worked out every detail yet. Then the discussion moved on without me. It was a small moment. Tiny, really. But small moments have a way of revealing larger truths. That night, after everyone left, I stood in the kitchen loading dishes into the dishwasher. Robert wandered in and thanked me for dinner. I smiled and told him I was glad everyone enjoyed themselves. Then I asked if he had noticed the vacation conversation. He looked confused. When I explained, he shrugged and said I was probably reading too much into it. They love you, Margaret. Do not overthink things. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was overthinking. Yet something inside me had begun paying attention in a way it never had before. Once you notice being overlooked, it becomes difficult to ignore. During the following months, similar moments appeared everywhere. Family group photos where nobody called me into the frame until the last second. Decisions made without including me. Plans discussed around me instead of with me. Jennifer was not cruel. Daniel was not ungrateful. Robert was not unkind. That was what made the situation so painful. Nobody intended to hurt me. They had simply grown accustomed to a version of life where I handled everything quietly in the background. The more I observed, the more I realized something uncomfortable. My family loved what I did for them. I was no longer certain they truly saw me. And for the first time in 43 years, I found myself wondering who Margaret Collins would be if she stopped being useful. The realization did not arrive all at once. It came in pieces. A forgotten invitation. A conversation that continued without me. A decision made before anyone thought to ask my opinion. Individually, none of those moments seemed important. Together, they painted a picture I could no longer ignore. One Sunday afternoon, the entire family gathered at Daniel and Jennifer's house for a barbecue. It was one of those warm Ohio days when the sky seemed impossibly blue and children spent hours running through the backyard without a care in the world. I arrived early, as usual. Jennifer had asked if I could help prepare side dishes and organize the serving table. Of course, I agreed. By noon, I had arranged platters, prepared desserts, and helped set up enough chairs for nearly 20 people. As guests began arriving, the house filled with laughter and conversation. For a while, everything felt normal. Then something happened that stayed with me long after the day ended. Several family members were sitting around the patio discussing future plans. Someone mentioned renovating part of Daniel and Jennifer's home. Ideas were exchanged. Budgets were discussed. Timelines were considered. I listened quietly because I knew more about home projects than most people realized. After all, Robert and I had spent decades maintaining our own house. I waited for a natural opening and offered a suggestion about contractors. Nobody responded. At first, I assumed they had not heard me. A few minutes later, another relative suggested nearly the exact same thing. Suddenly everyone praised the idea. The conversation moved forward as though my contribution had never existed. It was such a small moment that nobody else would have noticed. I noticed. The strange part was that nobody seemed intentionally dismissive. Daniel smiled at me several times throughout the afternoon. Jennifer thanked me for bringing dessert. The grandchildren hugged me when they arrived. Yet beneath all those pleasant interactions was an uncomfortable truth. I was becoming part of the furniture. Appreciated. Familiar. Useful. Invisible. Later that evening, while helping clean the kitchen, I overheard Jennifer speaking with a friend. She was describing how difficult it was to balance work, parenting, and household responsibilities. Her friend asked how she managed everything. Jennifer laughed and said she was lucky because things always seemed to work themselves out. I stood at the sink holding a dish towel when I heard those words. Things always seemed to work themselves out. Not because of magic. Not because of luck. Because someone spent years making sure they did. For the first time, I felt something unexpected. Not anger. Not resentment. Sadness. A deep sadness I could not easily explain. When I returned home that night, I sat alone on the back porch. The sun had already disappeared below the horizon, leaving only a soft orange glow across the neighborhood. Robert joined me a few minutes later. He asked if something was bothering me. I considered telling him everything. Instead, I asked a simple question. If I stopped doing all the things I normally do, how long would it take people to notice? He laughed gently and said that was a strange question. Then he told me everyone appreciated me more than I realized. I wanted to believe him. Truly, I did. But appreciation and awareness are not the same thing. One means people are grateful. The other means people actually see you. As the weeks continued, I began paying attention to something else. I could remember countless sacrifices I had made for my family over the years. Opportunities declined. Dreams postponed. Plans adjusted. Yet nobody knew about most of them because I had never talked about them. Perhaps that was my mistake. Perhaps I had spent so much time protecting everyone else's happiness that I had quietly erased parts of myself along the way. And the more I thought about it, the more I began to realize there were entire chapters of my life that my family had never even known existed. There was a time when I believed sacrifice was invisible only because it happened quietly. As I grew older, I began to understand something different. Sometimes sacrifice becomes invisible because the people benefiting from it never have a reason to look for it. The chapters of my life that nobody knew about were not dramatic. They were simply choices. Thousands of choices made one after another over decades. When Daniel was young, I had been offered a management position at a regional company where I worked part-time. The promotion would have doubled my salary. It also would have required frequent travel and long hours away from home. At the time, Daniel was struggling in school and Robert's work schedule kept him away most evenings. I turned the promotion down without hesitation. I never told anyone how difficult that decision had been. Years later, I discovered that same position eventually led several people into executive careers. I was genuinely happy for them. Still, every now and then I wondered what might have happened if I had chosen differently. There were other moments too. I loved painting when I was younger. Not professionally. Just for myself. Watercolors mostly. Landscapes. Small town streets. Quiet places that made me feel peaceful. I once spent nearly a year attending weekend classes with a local artist. My instructor encouraged me to apply for an intensive program in Chicago. He believed I had talent worth developing. The application sat on my desk for weeks. Then Robert's father became ill. Family responsibilities increased. The application deadline passed. Life moved on. Nobody ever knew about that opportunity except me. I never blamed anyone for those choices. That part is important. Daniel did not ask me to decline the promotion. Robert did not ask me to abandon painting. Jennifer certainly had nothing to do with any of it. The decisions belonged to me. Yet over time I noticed something strange. Everyone knew the story of what they had accomplished. Very few people knew the story of what I had given up along the way. One afternoon, while organizing boxes in the basement, I found an old folder filled with papers from different stages of my life. Job offers. Certificates. Letters. Photographs. I sat on the floor for nearly 2 hours looking through them. It felt like meeting a younger version of myself. A version full of plans and possibilities. A version I had not thought about in years. When Robert came downstairs, he smiled and asked what I was doing. I showed him some of the documents. He seemed surprised. Not because the papers existed. Because he had forgotten about them entirely. The realization stung more than I expected. If the man I spent 43 years with had forgotten those pieces of my life, how could anyone else remember them? A few weeks later, the family gathered for Sunday dinner at our house. During the meal, Daniel talked about career goals. Jennifer discussed future investments. The grandchildren shared dreams about colleges and professions they hoped to pursue one day. I listened carefully and encouraged all of them. Then a thought crossed my mind. Every person at that table had ambitions that were visible. Recognized. Supported. Somewhere along the way, my ambitions had quietly disappeared from the conversation. Not because anyone intentionally erased them. Because I had stopped mentioning them myself. After dinner, Jennifer thanked me for another wonderful meal. She called me amazing. She said she did not know how I managed to keep everything together all the time. I smiled and accepted the compliment. But later that evening, her words echoed in my mind. She admired the person who held everything together. I was no longer certain anyone knew the woman underneath. And for the first time in decades, I found myself wondering whether my family loved Margaret Collins the person, or simply the role she had spent her entire life performing. The older I became, the more I realized that families are often protected by things nobody sees. Most people imagine crises as dramatic events that everyone remembers. In reality, many family disasters are prevented quietly, long before anyone notices they were ever possible. Over the years, I became the keeper of those quiet moments. Not because anyone appointed me to the role. Because someone had to do it. I remember when Daniel was 23 and struggling with debt after a series of poor financial decisions. He was embarrassed and frightened. He came to me late one evening after Robert had already gone to bed. He sat at the kitchen table staring into a cup of coffee for nearly 20 minutes before finally telling me the truth. The amount was not catastrophic, But it was enough to create serious problems for a young man trying to build a future. Together we made a plan. I helped him organize payments. I adjusted parts of our own budget. For nearly 2 years, I quietly filled financial gaps whenever necessary until he regained stability. Nobody else ever knew. Not even Robert. Years later, Daniel would proudly talk about overcoming challenges early in adulthood. Every time he told the story, I smiled and listened. I never corrected him. I never reminded him how close he had come to losing everything. I wanted him to feel proud of himself. Then there was the year Robert nearly lost his job. A corporate restructuring threatened hundreds of positions. The stress affected him deeply. He stopped sleeping well. He became withdrawn and worried. Every evening I listened while he talked through his fears. I reassured him when he doubted himself. I handled additional responsibilities around the house so he could focus on work. Eventually things improved. The crisis passed. Life returned to normal. Over time, even Robert seemed to forget how difficult that period had been. I never did. Jennifer benefited from similar acts of protection without realizing it. When the grandchildren were young, there were months when balancing childcare and work became nearly impossible for her. I rearranged schedules, canceled personal plans, and spent countless hours helping wherever needed. I did not keep score. That was never the point. Families are supposed to help each other. Yet as I reflected on those years, I noticed a pattern. Every major challenge seemed to leave visible heroes and invisible ones. The visible heroes received praise. The invisible ones simply moved on to the next responsibility. One rainy afternoon, I opened an old cedar chest in the attic. Inside were journals I had kept throughout different stages of my life. Nothing dramatic. Just observations, memories, and reflections. I spent hours reading entries I had not seen in years. Page after page reminded me of moments my family had long forgotten. There were entries about helping Daniel through difficult periods. Entries about supporting Robert during career setbacks. Entries about caring for relatives during illnesses. Entire chapters of family history existed only because I had recorded them. As evening approached, I closed the final journal and sat quietly beside the attic window. Rain tapped softly against the glass. For the first time, I allowed myself to acknowledge something I had avoided for decades. I had spent much of my life protecting the people I loved from burdens they never even knew existed. I was not angry about it. I did not regret it. But I suddenly understood why I felt invisible. People cannot appreciate sacrifices they never see. They cannot value stories they never hear. Downstairs, my phone rang. It was Jennifer asking if I could watch the grandchildren the following weekend because she and Daniel had plans. I smiled and told her I would be happy to help. After hanging up, I looked back toward the journals resting inside the cedar chest. Those pages contained a version of Margaret Collins my family had never met. And a quiet thought entered my mind. If a day ever came when I was no longer here, those journals might tell a very different story than the one everyone thought they knew. The changes began so quietly that I almost convinced myself they were nothing. A little more fatigue than usual. A little less energy at the end of the day. Tasks that once felt effortless suddenly required more planning. At first, I blamed age. After all, I was no longer the young woman who could clean an entire house, host a family dinner, and still have enough energy left to help with homework afterward. I told myself it was normal. Yet something inside me knew better. One morning, I found myself sitting in the kitchen long after my coffee had gone cold. I had a list of errands to run, meals to prepare, and phone calls to return. Normally, I would have started immediately. Instead, I simply sat there staring out the window. The exhaustion felt different. Deeper. Robert noticed it before anyone else. He asked if I was sleeping well. I smiled and told him I was fine. That answer had become a habit over the years. Fine was easier than explanations. Fine allowed everyone else to continue with their lives without worry. A few weeks later, my doctor recommended additional testing. Nothing alarming, he said. Just precautionary. I nodded and agreed. Then I drove home alone and spent nearly an hour sitting in my car in the driveway. Not because I was frightened. Because I was thinking. For decades, I had measured my value by what I could do for other people. What would happen if I could not do those things anymore? The thought unsettled me more than any medical appointment. Life continued as usual. Daniel remained busy with work. Jennifer balanced a demanding schedule. The grandchildren filled their days with school, sports, and activities. Everyone had responsibilities. Everyone had somewhere to be. I understood that. Truly, I did. Yet I began noticing how dependent our routines were on the assumption that I would always be available. If someone needed childcare, they called me. If a family gathering required planning, they called me. If schedules became complicated, they called me. Nobody was being selfish. They were simply following patterns established over decades. One afternoon, Jennifer called asking if I could watch the children for an entire weekend because she and Daniel needed time away. Normally, I would have answered immediately. This time, I hesitated. Only for a second. But I hesitated. Jennifer noticed. Her voice changed. She asked if everything was all right. I quickly reassured her and agreed to help. After the call ended, I sat quietly for several minutes. The truth was simple. For the first time in my life, I was not entirely sure how much energy I would have by the end of the week. That realization stayed with me. As the months passed, I began sorting through old papers more frequently. The journals. The photographs. The letters. At first, I told myself I was simply organizing. Deep down, I think I was trying to preserve pieces of a life that nobody else had fully seen. One evening, while reading an entry from nearly 20 years earlier, I came across a sentence I had written after a particularly difficult period. It said, "One day people may understand how much love lived in the things I never talked about." I stared at those words for a long time. I could not remember writing them. Yet they felt strangely important now. Around that same time, my doctor finally called with results and asked me to come into the office. His tone was professional and kind, but serious enough that I understood immediately. Driving to that appointment, I found myself thinking less about fear and more about unfinished conversations. There were stories my family did not know. Sacrifices they never saw. Truths hidden inside journals stored in an attic. As I sat in the examination room waiting for the doctor to enter, a single realization settled over me with surprising clarity. Everyone in my life assumed there would always be more time. And until that moment, so had I. The doctor was kind. That is what I remember most. He spoke carefully, choosing his words with the compassion of someone who had delivered difficult news many times before. I listened quietly as he explained the results and outlined the road ahead. There were treatments available. There were options. There was hope. Yet there was also uncertainty, and for the first time in decades, uncertainty belonged to me rather than someone I loved. I drove home that afternoon beneath a gray Ohio sky, thinking about all the years I had spent preparing everyone else for life's challenges. Somehow, I had never prepared myself for this one. When I pulled into the driveway, I sat in the car for several minutes before going inside. The house looked exactly the same as it always had. The flower beds were neatly maintained. The curtains hung in the windows I had decorated years ago. Everything appeared unchanged. Yet I felt as though I had crossed an invisible line. That evening, I told Robert the truth. The conversation was quieter than I expected. He listened without interrupting. When I finished speaking, he reached across the table and held my hand. Neither of us cried. Neither of us pretended everything would be fine. We simply sat together in silence. After 43 years of marriage, silence can sometimes say more than words. Over the following weeks, I began noticing something curious. While everyone continued living their normal lives, my perspective started changing. Tasks that once felt routine suddenly seemed meaningful. Morning coffee. Family dinners. Phone calls from the grandchildren. Even folding laundry carried a strange sense of importance. I found myself paying attention to moments I might once have rushed through. At the same time, another thought kept returning. There were things my family needed to know. Not because I wanted sympathy. Not because I wanted recognition. Because there were parts of my life they had never truly seen. One afternoon, I climbed into the attic and opened the cedar chest again. The journals remained exactly where I had left them. Dust floated through thin beams of sunlight coming from the small window overhead. I spent hours reading old entries. Some made me smile. Others made me laugh at forgotten memories. A few brought tears to my eyes. By the end of the afternoon, I had reached a decision. I would leave something behind. Not instructions. Not financial documents. Something more important. A letter. I purchased a new notebook and began writing that very evening. At first, the words came slowly. Then they came faster. I wrote about the years nobody remembered. I wrote about dreams postponed and opportunities declined. I wrote about the quiet victories and hidden sacrifices. Most importantly, I wrote about love. Not the dramatic kind people celebrate in movies. The everyday kind. The kind that wakes up early. Shows up consistently. Solves problems without asking for credit. As days turned into weeks, the letter grew longer. Sometimes I wrote after midnight when the house was quiet. Other times I added a few paragraphs during peaceful afternoons. I never told anyone what I was doing. Not Robert. Not Daniel. Not Jennifer. The letter was not meant to change how they treated me while I was alive. It was meant to help them understand after they no longer had the chance to ask questions. One evening, after finishing another section, I reread several pages and realized something unexpected. The letter was no longer just a record of my life. It was a mirror. For the first time, I could clearly see the woman I had become beneath all the responsibilities and expectations. And as I turned to a fresh page, I began writing the truths that would surprise my family most of all. The final months passed more quickly than I expected. There were good days filled with laughter and familiar routines. There were difficult days when even simple tasks required more effort than before. Through it all, I continued writing. By the time I finished the letter, it had become something far larger than I originally intended. Tucked between its pages were copies of journal entries, photographs, old documents, and pieces of a life my family had never fully known. I placed everything carefully inside a large envelope and left instructions for Robert. When the time came, he was to gather everyone together and let them read it. Then life carried us forward until one day it did not. The house that had always been full of activity became painfully quiet. For the first time in decades, family dinners stopped happening automatically. Birthdays required planning that nobody knew how to do. Holidays felt strangely incomplete. At first, everyone assumed they were simply grieving. Then the envelope was opened. Robert invited Daniel and Jennifer to the house one rainy Saturday afternoon. The grandchildren stayed with relatives while the adults sat around the dining room table where so many family memories had been made. The envelope rested in the center of the table. Nobody spoke much at first. Robert eventually began reading aloud. The opening pages were gentle. Memories. Family stories. Expressions of love. Then the deeper truths emerged. They learned about the promotion I had declined. They learned about the art program I never attended. They learned about the financial struggles I had quietly helped Daniel overcome. Daniel reportedly lowered his head into his hands when he reached that section. Jennifer discovered entries describing countless weekends when I had rearranged my life to help her family without ever mentioning the sacrifices involved. Robert found pages recounting difficult years of our marriage that I had helped carry without complaint. Page after page revealed a version of Margaret Collins they had never truly seen. The greatest shock was not the sacrifices themselves. It was realizing how little they had known about the person making them. Jennifer later admitted that she cried when she reached a passage describing the day I overheard her saying that things always seemed to work themselves out. She finally understood why those words had mattered. Daniel reportedly spent nearly an hour reading and rereading the journal entries about his early adulthood. Robert found a photograph of me holding one of my watercolor paintings from decades earlier. On the back, I had written a simple note. There are many versions of ourselves that the people we love never get the chance to meet. By evening, nobody was speaking very much. The room was filled with silence and scattered papers. Not angry silence. Heartbroken silence. The kind that arrives when people suddenly see a familiar life from an entirely different perspective. For years, they had appreciated what I did. Now, for the first time, they were beginning to understand who I had been. And as they continued reading the final pages, they discovered the truth I had saved for last. I had never wanted recognition. I had never wanted repayment. I had only wanted to be seen. The final pages of the letter were the hardest for them to read. Not because they contained anger. There was none. Not because they contained blame. There was very little of that. They were difficult because they contained honesty. The kind of honesty that arrives too late to be answered. Robert later said the room felt smaller as he read the last section aloud. Every sentence seemed to remove another layer of assumptions they had carried for years. In those final pages, I explained something I had only recently understood myself. A perfect wife is often celebrated for how much she gives. A perfect mother is praised for how much she sacrifices. A perfect grandmother is admired for how much she helps. Yet somewhere along the way, people stop asking what those things cost. They admire the service and forget the person. I wrote that I had loved my family completely. Every meal. Every school event. Every late-night conversation. Every difficult season. Every ordinary day. None of it had been a burden. The sadness came from realizing that while everyone knew what I had done, very few people knew who I was. When Robert reached those words, he reportedly stopped reading for several minutes. Daniel eventually took over. His voice shook through much of the remaining letter. Jennifer sat quietly beside him with tears running down her face. Then they reached the final paragraph. The paragraph that explained everything. I wrote that people might call what happened my final revenge. If they did, they would misunderstand it. Revenge suggests intention. Revenge suggests punishment. I never wanted anyone to suffer. I never wanted guilt to become a permanent companion in their lives. The truth was much simpler. My absence would accomplish what my presence never could. It would force everyone to notice the spaces I had quietly filled for decades. It would reveal the countless acts of love hidden inside ordinary routines. It would finally introduce them to the woman standing behind the role they had always seen. That was not revenge. It was recognition arriving too late. Months passed after the letter was finished. Then a year. Small changes began appearing throughout the family. Daniel started asking deeper questions when people shared their experiences. He listened more carefully. Jennifer became intentional about expressing gratitude, not only for large gestures but for small everyday acts that often go unnoticed. Robert found my old watercolor supplies in the attic and framed several paintings I had completed decades earlier. They hung throughout the house where everyone could see them. For the first time, visitors learned that Margaret Collins had been more than a wife, mother, and grandmother. She had been an artist too. Family gatherings slowly changed. Stories about me were no longer limited to recipes, holidays, and traditions. People began sharing memories from the journals. Memories that revealed dreams, fears, ambitions, and choices nobody had understood before. In a strange way, they finally met the person who had been standing beside them all along. Years later, one of my grandchildren reportedly asked why everyone spoke about me with such emotion. Robert smiled and answered with a truth that took our family far too long to learn. He said that some people spend their entire lives giving love so consistently that everyone mistakes it for something ordinary. Then one day they are gone, and you realize it was never ordinary at all. If there was any justice in my story, it was not found in regret. It was found in understanding. The people I loved eventually saw me. Not the role. Not the responsibilities. Not the expectations. Me. And in the end, that was all I had ever wanted.